First of all, thanks for coming, and it's a great pleasure for me to present today. First of all, very quickly introduce myself. My name is Olivia Lee. I'm currently the head of risk and regulatory compliance at CredibAI. Myself also have worked in senior positions at Morgan Stanley UK, HSBC UK France, and Citigroups in US. Today, I was very delighted to be invited to talk about the AI and the global sanctions compliance. So for the next 20 minutes, we'll quickly go through the financial sanctions, what exactly it means by financial sanctions. Is there any difference between financial sanctions and anti-money laundering or the counter-terrorist financing? Secondly, is the complexity in sanctions implementation and compliance. Then we will move on to the augmented AI solutions. I will walk you through the examples actually we are doing inside of CredibAI. And finally, at the very end, I'm very happy to take any questions. So let's just get a quick snapshot. So that is everybody is already being aware, what's going on between the Ukraine and Russia. So let's just take out the data related to EU sanctions, for example. So you can see the timeline at the bottom. So if we look at the data from October 2021 to March 15th, so that is this Tuesday, and over the 6 months, and can you see the increase, the enormous increase of the financial sanctions? So basically, you can see that over the 6 months, is increased by around 396%. That means it increased by nearly 4 times. Okay. Then if you go back to September, 10th of September 2021, if we look at that data, so that means it has sparked up around 354%. Again, so what does it mean to financial services? Are you ready to stay in compliance in face with this crazy compliance burden? Is your system ready, or do you have the internal robust control to deal with the regulations? So now we look at this, the bit which is the essential for financial sanctions. So what exactly is financial sanctions? And based on the UK regulators, the latest survey across the financial services inside the UK, and the outcome of the survey turned out that most of the management in the top financial services and banking and providers, payment providers included, they don't have a clear understanding of financial sanctions. Most of them actually assume that as well as we have the anti-money laundering and the CFI, CTF, the counter-terrorist financing screening process, as long as we have the KYC screening, as long as we have the due diligence process in place, that means we are good with the financial sanctions compliance. But this is completely wrong. And if you look at the nature of the anti-money laundering and the counter-terrorist financing, that is deal with crimes. That is a prohibit and combat criminal activities and offenses. And there is a clear-cut legal foundations. So there's no, probably it's anti-money laundering, or probably it's terrorism-related activity, or probably not. There's no such ambiguity per se. However, you look at the financial sanctions. So, each financial services, we have the legal counsel. So you approach the legal counsel, and you will have the clear identifications about the financial sanctions. The financial sanctions increasingly, if we will look at recent cases again and again, it's growing to be a tool for political influence. And so that is basically a signal to the nationwide or worldwide that we actually wanted to isolate certain individuals or the certain entities or certain vessels or certain associated entities and persons. And we, because what is the grounds? The grounds is not necessarily legal, certainly not necessarily criminal. So the ground more or less is because, some of the states or organizations like UN, they think that certain behaviors are not desirable, or certain behaviors of certain regime or certain states are aggressive, and therefore they need to be to be notified, they need to be warned, and they need to be under control. And that is about the essence of financial sanctions. And clearly, you can see that is go above and beyond financial crimes. Secondly, who exactly is subject to the financial sanctions screening? So when the banks and service providers, we say, okay, we have applications, APIs to run through those sanctions screening, so we are good. It's the case. So they believe that a PEP is a politically exposed persons. Okay, as long as we can identify that, yes or no, then the screening is finished. Not really. So we know that PEP is just a very part of the picture, very small part of the pictures. And also, PEPs are subject to explanation. Like some people say, okay, I'm a government official, so I worked for a government body, so am I PEP? Yes or no? Not necessarily, right? So if you are a civil servant and you haven't have any, phenomenal political influence, and you are not considered a PEP. So overseas clients and business only, and some companies say, oh, we have a very limited client base, so we are not dealing with business or customers outside of UK, so we are safe. We don't need to think about financial sanctions screening. And that is not true either, because if your UK-based customers or businesses have certain direct or indirect connections with the sanction targets, then you are liable for financial sanction compliance. Clients with large financial transactions, that is, again, is a common misconcept around this topic. So, if we have dealing with very small transactions, below even 100 or below 5,000, is it significant enough to even deal with financial sanctions? The answer is certainly yes, because there is actually no lower limit for financial sanctions. So as long as the target is involved, even in the extreme case, even it is zero. So even the transaction volume is zero, and you provide some just a simple business consultant advisory services to them, okay, free of charge. But unfortunately, you are submitted to financial sanctions compliance because you have been dealing with that entities and individuals related to the sanction list or indirectly associated with the sanction targets. The last bit about who is obligated to comply. So that is very interesting aspect as well. So if we look at the regulations, so which I will give you a detailed view later on, it's quite complex in terms of obligations. So when we talk about obligations, if you approach to the regulators, like what I have dealt before, the regulator will say, okay, it's up to your interpretation, and if you disagree what we are published, or if you want further clarifications about the sanction list, and please, sit together with the legal counsel at your bank and, feel free to reach upon consensus, but they wouldn't give you a clear-cut response whatsoever. So why? Why it's not easy to clarify who is obligated? So, if you look at the surface of all the published sanctions list and regulations is saying, okay, for example, in the UK, it's talking about the UK nationals. So as long as you are UK nationals, no matter where you are living, traveling, or doing business, you are subject to this regulation. So you are liable to comply in any cases. And this same logic applies to entities. And by entities, what I mean is could be trusts, could be partnerships, could be simply unincorporated business. Some people say they are working as an independent consultant and self-employed. They don't have official LTD registered anywhere. And unfortunately, they are subject to the sanctions compliance as well. There's no way you can avoid or escape from these obligations. So in other countries, for example, US, the situation is much more complex than the UK. For example, in the US, what you are dealing with is not only the US citizens and US entities and US organizations, but you are also dealing with goods and components. So like your business or your customers actually using some US produced or adopted or manufactured goods, even components. I'm sorry, you are subject to financial sanctions. So, and it's even go further beyond this. That means, for example, you have some service providers down your supply chain. Or, for example, you have your company has cleaning services, and these cleaning services actually got the supplies from US. Or these cleaning services actually have transactions or business ties with targeted US companies and entities. I'm sorry, again, your company actually is liable for financial sanction screening because you have this type of even indirect and intangible connections. So that's about the US. And more importantly, transactions or services traded in US dollars. So if you have any payment involving US dollars, and that is another flag for the US sanctions regulations to kick in. So that's about the US, but much wider. If you look at the UN and the EU, so for UN, so UN basically, whenever the UN publish a sanction list, that is automatically applicable to all the states, and so all the government have to take it into account and put it into their national database for the sanction targets as well. EU is a similar case, and it actually have the layers regulations and will be complied by the individual states. So the next part, we look at the complexity. This is what I just softly touched about. Due to the time constraint for today, so I will just look at the two parts, so UK and the US. UK, when we look at the sanctions, a lot of even seasoned compliance officers, they have such misunderstanding. Is they think, oh, it's easy. Look at it, we just running the database, do the scanning, and find the name match or date of birth or match or the citizenship or passport number match, and that is done. That's exactly why the sanctions compliance is extremely challenging. You look at the foundations. What is the sanctions about? Sanctions about, like, UN I already mentioned earlier. So for the UK is from HM Treasury, and HM Treasury directly gives the instructions to the OFSI. So OFSI would pass on the consolidated list to the National Crime Agency. So National Crime Agency, again, is passed by its Financial Intelligence Unit to actually execute the sanctions regulations. And another route is go straight to the FCA. And third route is via Bank of England, but implemented by the PRA. However, this is still just a corner of what we can see. When the OFSI implement, administrate, and execute about any sanction regulations is actually also in consultation with other government bodies, like Home Office. Home Office has border controls, and that will be provided important intelligence to the OFSI for decision making, and the Department of International Trade, FCDO, and HMRC, Department of Transport. So it's actually a collaborative intelligence and efforts. And that's why it's not easy to handle or do the clear match. That's also one of the fundamental sources for actually false positive results in screening. So that's about the UK. And look at the US. The US, more and more people and organizations are actually worried about the sanctions regime from the US side, because it looks quite complicated. So US President, Secretary of State, Secretaries of Treasury, and the OFAC, everybody in the financial services aware of that directory, also Office of Foreign Assets. And it's also linked, have direct link and collaborations with the National Security Council. So that means that what's happening with the international trade, and the law enforcement, and the intelligence and the Department of Commerce. So that is consolidated information, and that is provided to the OFAC and the U.S. President to gather the information and in order to formulate the corresponding sanction lists, and also the changes in the sanction list as well. So when the sanctions policies need to be implemented and executed, and there's three arms. So the Department of Justice and State of Department of Legal team and the White House attorneys. So that is about the legal foundations, and the legal foundations give everybody a clear pictures and a warning that why financial sanctions is important and why it's much more significant than combating financial crime. So now we move on to look at the complexity when the financial services in the action of implementing such sanction compliance regulations. So there's various problems with current screening process. More or less, medium or large financial services, they have a sort of a process in place. We have to call it a sort of, and there's reason why. Because, for example, the confusions of anti-money laundering and KYC and counter-terrorist financing checks. And what we mentioned earlier, that there is a fine line between those checks and the sanction screening checks, because sanction screening checks, as the nature and the scope, is about political influence, is about the foreign policies. That is a core part. But of course, there are occasions you can see crossover between the anti-money laundering, the KYC, and the counter, the terrorist financing, and the sanctions. There's cases basically that is clear financial crime. Then in those cases, you can see the overlaps between those two screening process. Then second part is about control and ownership verification. And people would think, that is interesting part. I talked with a lot of the clients and senior bankers. What they found is it's actually really challenging. Like what we said earlier. So it's ultimately not looking for direct match. Like you have the sanction list, the downway and many businesses are still doing that, is you actually do the one-to-one direct matching to see the name matching, the passport number matching, the home address, business address, the registered company number is that a direct match. Or you look at, is there any variations in the published consolidated list? For example, in UK is HMT list. You need to look for that list, right? And most cases, you get the misleading result. So it could be a false positive or false negative. And a lot of cases you are not able to capture and detect it at all, because the key part and the core part of the control and the ownership verification is to locate ultimate beneficial owners. So who is ultimately benefit from certain transactions and relationships, etc. So that's like, I can give you one example. So look at down the supply chain. If you have some local agent have indirect connections, all the local agent serving you actually has been a friend to the targeted Russian citizens, then actually that is the part is the target matching that is subject to the sanction regulations. And even though that name or that entity didn't appear on the government consolidated list at all. And unfortunately, you are liable for the consequence. Then third aspect is a calibration of automated sanctions screening rules. We know that now a lot of businesses, they are aware that they need to adopt advanced even AI solutions. So they started using automated sanctions screening rules in the system. However, it is not ideal, and there's quite a few problems. So for example, the reason we dig in the reason number one is the list is dynamic. The list is ever growing, so it's growing daily, and it's changing daily as well. Sometimes you say, okay, it's published periodically. Yes, that is about publish to you, but internally, inside of the government body we mentioned earlier, they already actually keep updating the list, removing certain targets and adding new targets, and that is and stopping process. So that's number one reason. Number two reason is about open to interpretation. So even let's assume the consolidated list hasn't been changed for months or haven't been changed for days. Does it mean that you actually shoulder less liabilities or obligations in terms of screening your clients and business? Not necessary, because if you look at the regulators and the legal advice provided to you, it says that, okay, you can not only screening based on the list, you have to go above and beyond and locate the direct and indirect associated companies or goods or trades or transactions or even the relationship. Thirdly, it's about the vague target identifier. Many people, when they participated in the survey conducted by the UK regulators, and they provided this feedback. Regulators, can you guys, do certain job to help us make our screening easier? Because the identifier is quite vague. And this is not only the case for the UK, but worldwide. UN list is quite vague. US sanction list is vague. But ultimately, who actually going to be liable for the breach consequences? Who will be ultimately fined? Is it the financial services themselves? So there's no way to escape just saying, okay, because the identifier is not that useful, that's why we failed to comply. And I'm sorry, and that is not acceptable excuse either. So that is the third aspect. Further down is vertical misalignment, I would say. Misalignment, what I mean exactly by that is we noticed that earlier page is that there's several government bodies involved, right? So when within one state, one country, and different government bodies may issue different lists. And in some cases, you'll find they are actually contradictory with each other. So some name is appear in one list, but not appear in another list published by the same country authorities. So what shall you do? The simple AML or KYC or CFT checks wouldn't satisfy this requirement at all. Then the other critical aspect is about horizontally. So we look at country by country. UK is HMT list, and the US is OFAC list, EU list, and UN has its own list. So all the different organizations and publishing those kind of consolidated target list, then you would able to know easily. A lot of cases is contradict with each other, and as a financial services, it's difficult for us to understand what we're supposed to do. But again, we are liable for for any compliance failures. The last part I would say about the capabilities and limitations of existing system and controls. We talked about with a lot of engineers and solicitors and compliance officers, and we noticed that currently a lot of the system is running. However, there's unknown capabilities and limitations. So I would put it. I would break it down into 3 parts. So first is about under and over screening. Like if you put too much resources linked to too many databases and external sources of information, news and media, so you probably over screening and your clients and the business involved. But a lot of time, as mentioned in part 1, confusion of the AML, KYC, CTF checks is, in that case, is under screening. Both are not desirable. Then the second component is about equivalence. Equivalence is, over the past few years, the business actually were allowed to source this sanctions screening process to the third party or agent. We'll say, all your business partners, like my company is taking one referred client from another company. So I would assume, the other companies already screened according to the sanctions regulations, so I don't need to do anything, and I'm not liable for any consequences. Same case applicable to your own third party. So you just hired a third party to do this part of sanctions compliance screening process for you, and whatever the result is, they give it back to you. You'll say, okay, they were the organization did this process, therefore they will be liable if the checks turned out to be wrong. However, recently those obligation again is coming back. So that means that you cannot leverage external services and your business partners for this sanctions screening, and you will be ultimately liable whatever the consequences are. The last bit about the misalignment in sensitive cases, that is one good example to demonstrate the last part is the capabilities and limitations. So the interesting case is about Iran. So Iran's if you look at the data, there's times that U.S. basically reinstate the sanctions measures against Iran, but during the same period, EU actually lifted the sanctions measures, basically provided sanctions relief, and encourage the EU entities and individuals to engage with Iran for commercial and financial collaborations. So in that case, so you are a financial services provider, what do you need to do? Clearly, your current system is unlikely to satisfy this requirement because it's too complex, it's too tricky. So now we we move on to the solution part. So, right, we talked quite a lot about the legal part and the complex realities. Now we move to the most significant component is about the solution. How we're going to deal with it. Augmented AI solutions. And below, I will talk about what the CredibAI currently able to provide. But this is, also a general knowledge and information. So, first of all, it's about the capabilities. When we're facing those limitations, and we realize that you need to be able to detect, process, understand, evaluate, and monitor, report, and predict the sanction breaches. And the key part, which is also increasingly difficult, is about understand, evaluate, and predict. So now we see that the financial sanctions burdens is growing daily, right? But most businesses, they are quite passive, in quite passive mode. They always wait and to respond. However, you are not able to build an advanced system overnight. The unfortunate reality is you are liable for the sanctions breaches overnight. As long as it's published, the ball is in your court, and the regulator can approach to you, ask, what have you done with it? So understand, evaluate, and predict are getting more and more important in terms of AI solutions in sanctions compliance. Second is data formats. So, working with a financial services provider, and even myself, I was, in charge of the regulatory project. And we realized that most of our capabilities are dealing with structured data, Word documents or Excel, CSV. And we actually noticed there's very few systems and facilities able to handle audio, video, image, and PDF. Okay, yeah, I'll wrap up quickly. Thank you. So the data source, again, is currently we have, internal of the bank, so we have the databases and system. Our internal system, we link them together easily. We also have a third party like Bloomberg, your business partners will share their system and with you. So that is roughly not a problem. However, it's actually challenging to track other sources like the social media and the news, and on an ongoing basis. That means 24/7, and you keep updating and refreshing your knowledge map. Is what your understanding of that certain entity and business. And that is one key capabilities about the data sources. Data processing capabilities. Inside of the investment banks, we noticed that it's quite easy to actually, the system is just down for no reason. That about the limitation processing. However, AI solutions, AI-powered solutions can go beyond and without such limitations in terms of how much data, what type of format we can processing. Last bit about output, visualization report. So the report is, the system will automatically generate a report for you as a basis. Then on top of that, your compliance officer, can do the final check and the final touch. The augmented AI solutions, here is basically a process in motion. So from the stage one, you capture and verification of the data about your clients and business, then data enrichment, you use an NLP and you use a natural language understanding and processing to enrich your data, connect with worldwide data sources 24/7. Then you move on to the B-scope sanctions screening. So when B-scope sanctions screening is basically talking about you can take into account the large worldwide range of regulations and dynamic laws and the keep changing sanctions list and the changing status and circumstances of the target person and entity as well. Then the graph methods applies to the investigation and continuous monitoring. This part is very sensitive and key because its essence is about continuous. So it's not just doing the periodic checks, what we normally do in financial services. Every 6 months or 1 to 2 years, you do one review and audit and refreshing. You have to do the B-scope continuous monitoring. Then the next step of risk rating, basically you use deep and Bayesian learning to make a decision for you. So in this case, it is really high risk, or medium risk, or low risk. And what we're supposed to do about it is that is the remediation recommendation by the system. The last bit is NLG, natural language generation, to produce the reporting. And again, that reporting, it provides the fundamentals, the facts, and the data, but it also, involves the compliance analysts and the managers to put their thoughts and integrate it together, become an enforceable case that you can actually submit to the regulator as a final result. So this is a little bit about CredibAI. You will have the slides later on, and how to get in touch.